After their playoff run of 2014, there were high hopes for the Dallas Cowboys heading into the 2015 season. A lot of people were looking at them with perhaps Super Bowl aspirations. I was looking at it at least as a team that was going to win their division, probably in a bit of a runaway, because I knew that division wasn't that good. That's what I felt, anyways. And ultimately, the division proved to not be good, but it was a surprise, I think, to a lot of people that the team bringing up the rear ended up being the Dallas Cowboys. You're talking about a team to kick off the season. They won on Sunday night against the New York Giants. They had to come from behind victory late. And, then again, we always get that kind of misguided narrative about Nick Romo always being clutch in the fourth quarter, even though that doesn't nearly tell the whole story of his late game performances. But a win is a win, and it was a divisional win. They lost Dez Bryant during the game, but you're like, okay, they lost Dez Bryant for a while. That hurts, that sucks, but they've still got Tony Romo, so they'll be able to tread water and get by while Dez Bryant recovers, and then when he comes back, this is going to be a team to reckon with in the second half of the season. So then, of course, in the next game against Philadelphia, Tony Romo breaks his collarbone. So he's going to be out for an extended period of time. And now you look at it, even with that happening, the Cowboys beat the Philadelphia Eagles. The Cowboys are 2-0 with 2 divisional wins, and you're sitting there and saying, hey, this is not going to be a good team for the next several weeks, but maybe they could do just enough to find a way to win a couple of games, kind of hang around and stick close enough, stick in striking distance to where when Romo and Dez Bryant come back, this team is going to be, again, a force to be reckoned with in the second half of the season and should still find a way to win the division. Well, then a crazy thing happened along the way. The Dallas Cowboys just sucked to high hell, and that's just the truth of the matter. They start Brandon Weeden for a few games, and it doesn't go great, but it wasn't terrible. But for some inexplicable reason, this team decided that Brandon Weeden was the problem, and they were going to go with Matt Castle. When you're in a place where you think Matt Castle is going to be your best option to win NFL games, you're in a bad place and in a bad, bad way. And it speaks in part to the lack of the Cowboys over the years, emphasizing developing a young quarterback behind Tony Romo, which is ridiculous, especially knowing some of the injury problems he had had in recent years, seeing his age. This organization got caught with their pants down. Once Romo got hurt, a lot of other things fell apart. It's not exclusively on the quarterback position, mind you, but it most certainly didn't help. And it was one of these things where as soon as they benched Brandon Weeden for Matt Castle, I said, this is not going to be a good way for the Cowboys to go. This is going to go poorly. It's going to go just as bad, if not worse. And I don't understand how anybody in their fucking right mind thought Matt Castle was going to be the savior of this Cowboys season in 2015. If you really thought this team was better off starting Matt Castle than Brandon Weeden, you're a fucking moron. Because at worst, it was a lateral move, and frankly, I think they downgraded, and I think the results of the season ended up bearing that out. I mean, even once they got Dez Bryant back, he wasn't the same player, and Matt Castle sucked. Then they do get Tony Romo back, and you're thinking, hey, they're still in striking distance. Now Romo is back. This team could do what they needed to do. They managed to hang around, even though they weren't winning games, but then ultimately, of course, they didn't. And ultimately, of course, Romo would go on to hurt his shoulder again and be out for the rest of the season. And the Cowboys, without Tony Romo, managed to win 2 out of 1 game, the entire year without Tony Romo. They won 1 game without Tony Romo as their starting quarterback. That's not a good thing. So it shouldn't be much of a surprise. The team finished 4-12, last in the NFC East. They finished last in a terrible division. That's not good. And the Cowboys now have the number 4 overall pick in the 2016 NFL Draft. So if there was a positive to come out of this season, that's probably it. I look at this Cowboys organization and I frankly wonder, for Jerry Jones, how can you justify keeping Jason Garrett as your head coach? This is a team that's had a lot of mediocrity, a lot of 8-8 years. Then last year you had that playoff appearance. But now this year, which should have been a year that measured the quality of the coaching that you had, your team went 4-12. And if anything, to me, Jason Garrett should be held accountable for the decision to play Matt Castle over Brandon Weeden. You gave Brandon Weeden only a couple of games, and then you go with Matt Castle. You give him even more to suck even worse. Frankly, when I see a Lovie Smith get fired after putting up a 4-win improvement from 2014 to 2015 without an organization really investing much on the side of the ball in the draft that he's an expert on, that is his bread and butter, which is the defense, How the hell does Jason Garrett still have a job with a 4-12 record? And a lot of other mediocre history behind him. I just don't get it. Yeah, I know he signed that big contract extension, what have you, but I mean, I'm just saying, Cowboys waste a lot of other money in a lot of other places. I don't know. I mean, so in general, this year it was a disaster for the Dallas Cowboys, and you probably always knew deep down that they were a Tony Romo injury away from being a bad football team. And we saw that this year. You could see some of the value of Tony Romo to that organization this year. There's no question about it. There wasn't a lot that went well. In terms of things that did go well, though, you did have Darren McFadden rush for over 1,000 yards behind that offensive line. And those numbers are a bit misleading because early on in the year they were going with Joseph Randle as the primary running back. So if McFadden, who early on to me always looked like the best option for him in the backfield, who always looked like the most explosive guy and the best ball carrier that they had, if he would have played as a starter and the feature back for all 16 games, he probably finishes with 1,200 to 1,300 rushing yards. And for a team that decided they weren't going to pay big money to DeMarco Murray because they had confidence in the system and the offensive line they had in front of them, in some ways, they were made to look right with what Darren McFadden did, in particular when you figure out what DeMarco Murray did when he went to Philadelphia. So McFadden over 1,000 yards rushing behind that line where he wasn't even the feature back for the entire season. You look at DeMarcus Lawrence on the defensive side of the ball. The 2014 second-round pick had a much better season in year two. He led the team in sacks. He showed me something. They needed somebody to show him something, and you got a marquee pick like DeMarcus Lawrence, shows you a little bit of something, shows you some of the potential that he has. That bodes well for the future. I thought Byron Jones, their first-round pick at times, showed me some nice flashes. We'll see how he develops going forward. Sean Lee managed to stay healthy for at least some of the season. And when Sean Lee's on the field, the Cowboys' defense is a little bit different. I mean, Sean Lee is a really quality football player. And when he played, he was really, really good this year. Frankly, the best player in the Dallas Cowboys, though, in 2015 was their kicker, Dan Bailey. He had an all-pro year. He was really, 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 really good. And that type of kicker can win you football games. That type of kicker can make a difference on special teams. Special teams are very important. You got a kicker the quality of Dan Bailey. I mean, it helps. So, that's something else that really went well for this Cowboys team. But that's about it, because there's a lot that didn't go well. Tony Romo getting hurt multiple times. Now you've got a quarterback that you've got a ton of money invested in over the next several years, who's in his mid-30s, who's coming off of a couple of shoulder injuries, and major shoulder injuries at that. And you break your collarbone like that, your clavicle a couple of times, how is he going to come back? Is there always going to be a risk of re-breaking? Is he going to have the same type of arm strength? Is he going to have the same type of accuracy and touch? Is he going to have the same type of confidence? Is he going to be afraid to stand in the pocket and take a big hit? I mean, these are significant, serious questions. Not only was it bad with what happened with Tony Romo and his injuries, but the fact they had no real quality young depth behind him at the position. Dez Bryant, you just gave him huge money in the offseason. You basically chose between him and DeMarco Murray. You went with Dez Bryant. Dez Bryant missed a good portion of the season, and even when he did play, he didn't look great. It looked like he came into the season out of shape to begin with, and then when he came back, he just didn't have the same pop or same explosiveness. Didn't help that he was having to play with quarterbacks like Matt Castle and Kellen Moore, I'll grant you, but Dez Bryant didn't have a good year. Then the whole Greg Hardy debacle. Oh, my God. I mean, there were moments where Hardy had some flashes after he came off of the 4-game suspension. But then, just as the season went along, he became more and more of a headache, more and more of the pain in the ass. Reports of many times that the guy was late. Clearly, a numbskull doesn't fucking get it. You paid him a lot of money to give you 6.5 sacks and a whole lot of headaches. And only 2 wins with him actually in the lineup. If there's any sweet poetic justice to the Cowboys, actually, in their signing of Greg Hardy, sorry, Stephen A. Smith, and your apologies for him, is that the Cowboys went 2-10 with Greg Hardy in their lineup. Well, there you go. Randy Gregory, their second-round pick in this past year's draft, did absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. No big surprise to me. Their run defense was pretty bad. For a team that is built on offense to run the ball, you would think on defense they would also build their defense around first and foremost stopping the run. But the run defense, teams could run on the Cowboys all year long. This Cowboys team went 1-9 versus teams that weren't in the NFC East. That's not good. I mean, they basically, if they weren't beating the scrubs in their own division, and yes, even the division champion Washington Redskins were scrubs too. They couldn't beat the other scrubs in the division. If they weren't beating the other scrubs in the division, they weren't beating anybody else. The only other team they beat were the Miami Dolphins. That tells you all you need to know. And they had 9 games offensively where they scored 20 points or less. Basically meaning that if their defense didn't play at a very, very high level, this team was going to lose a ton of games this year. Their defense didn't play at a high level, henceforth, they lost a lot of games this year. Now, in terms of offseason priorities for the Dallas Cowboys, first and foremost, you got to have Tony Romo and Dez Bryant get healthy. Because when those guys are healthy and playing at the levels that we're grown accustomed to seeing, this is an entirely different offense and, frankly, as a result, an entirely different football team. You were watching a football team in the Dallas Cowboys pretty much the majority of 2015 play without their leader, play without the guy in Tony Romo. This was a faceless, directionless organization that lacked leadership, and it showed. And it showed to me. They need those guys to get healthy. As much as anything else that can be done in this offseason, if they want to rebound in 2016, the Cowboys need Tony Romo and Dez Bryant to get healthy. The good thing for the Cowboys, though, is with that last place finish, they will get a last place schedule next year. So this is going to be a team that a lot of people are going to be talking about, in part, yes, just because it's the Dallas Cowboys, but also because of some of the talent they still have on this team and the fact that they will be playing the last place schedule. You're going to hear a lot of playoff talk, a lot of rebound talk about this Cowboys organization. The next thing this team needs to do, they need to move the fuck on from Greg Hardy. You gave him a one-year deal. You took a gamble. The gamble came up craps. Move the fuck on. You don't need him. You shouldn't want him. He serves you no great purpose because, if anything, he undermines the coaching staff by showing up late, and then the coaching staff doesn't help by not really holding him accountable. You allow this idiot to pop off at the mouth. He's arguing with coaches. He's arguing with teammates. You can't have that shit. He's not producing at nearly high enough level to where you could even begin to entertain the thought of allowing this fucking knucklehead to get away with this shit. They must move on from Greg Hardy and do it immediately. Don't even talk to him. Don't even engage him in conversation in free agency. You don't want anything. But this team also needs to prioritize getting some offensive playmakers in the offseason, between a combination perhaps of free agency and the draft. The part of the problem for the Cowboys for so many years is that they've managed the salary cap so poorly, so it limits a lot what they can do in free agency. But you look at this team, the whole decision to let DeMarco Murray go. Frankly, even though McFadden had over 1,000 yards this year as a runner, this wasn't the same offense. This wasn't the same running game from the Dallas Cowboys. So you could sit there and talk about it wasn't that big of a loss. I think it was. It was one of those mutually bad decisions for all parties involved. The Cowboys allowed DeMarco Murray to go where he was a great fit for them. DeMarco Murray chose to chase more money with the Philadelphia Eagles, and it became a disaster for him because he went from a system that was perfectly suited for him to a system that wasn't built around him whatsoever. They need some offensive playmakers, and you especially saw it once Dez Bryant got hurt. Their receiving core is terrible. Darren Williams, non-existent. Cole Beasley's not even that effective or consistent of a slot receiver. Jason Witten's getting old, and I thought you really started to see that this year. And in part, at times, they were asking them a lot to stay back in pass protection. They need some offensive playmakers really, really badly. And then they, of course, need defensive depth at all three levels of the defense. Their secondary is still not good. The linebacking core is the strength of the unit, but it could still be upgraded. Their defensive line, they need help, especially on the interior. So looking at this 2016 NFL Draft, with the Cowboys sitting there at the number 4 overall pick, what do they need to address? What directions could they be heading? Well, the number one need for this organization, period, no matter what anybody says, is quarterback. That has to be it. If you see somebody else as the number one need for this team as a defensive tackle or a wide receiver, they are wrong, period. For years, this organization has criminally neglected the backup quarterback position, and in 2015, those chickens eventually came home to roost. There has to be some type of contingency. There has to be some type of backup plan. There has to be some type of plan B. There has to be some type of vision for the future, because Romo, even if healthy the next several years, is not going to play forever. What do the Cowboys do going forward? And if he's not healthy, then what the hell do you do? Well, in 2015, you saw what happens, and the results were disaster. The number one need for this organization is a backup quarterback that they can draft and develop and could fill in for Romo more adequately than Whedon, Moore, and Castle did in 2015, or someday take over, most especially of all, for Tony Romo. They have to find that guy. And I'd be stunned, frankly, if this team didn't address that position in the first round with that number 4 overall pick, and I think it would be appropriate. To me, if I'm the Dallas Cowboys, I'm praying to God that Jared Goff falls, because I think he's the most natural, pure pocket passer in this draft. I think he's the most NFL-ready arm right now. Paxton Lynch's physical tools are appealing, as are Carson Wentz's. I still think Carson Wentz will be the #1 quarterback prospect in this draft class. But for the Cowboys, what the Cowboys are looking for, and what the Cowboys run, I think Jared Goff is the guy. Because you could even occasionally look at him and see some Romo elements to his game. In terms of other needs, though, outside of quarterback, which again is beyond question, no debate, the #1 need. Where else do they need help? Wide receiver. Even if Dez Bryant's healthy, they've got nothing else there. And if he's not healthy, they have nothing there. They really need a big-time playmaker at wide receiver. They need another dude. Now, I don't know that it's going to come in round 1, but round 2, round 3, that position does need to be addressed. They need some type of playmaker of some time. If a Corey Coleman falls there, then they go for somebody like him. Could it be a guy, I don't know, like a Josh Doxson? Could it be somebody like a Sterling Shepard or a Pharaoh Cooper, a Tyler Boyd in round 3? They need something at the wide receiver position that is credible and legitimate outside of Dez Bryant. They have to get that in this offseason and in this draft. I think they need to look as well throughout the rest of the draft and start to treat their defensive line like they did for the offensive line for years, where they invested a lot into it and they've seen some of the fruits of that. They need to do that on the defensive side of the ball. They've invested a couple of second-round picks in defensive ends in back-to-back years in DeMarcus Lawrence and Randy Gregory, but defensive end is still a huge need, and the interior of that defensive line is most certainly a big need. Now, at the 4th overall pick, you may hear some people argue for them taking a defensive tackle or a defensive end, and it could make some sense, but I would expect them, especially with the depth of that group in this draft, to be able to find a guy that could have an impact maybe even in rounds 3 or 4. They definitely need some help at the corner position. Byron Jones showed some promise. Morris Claiborne sucks. Brandon Carr is not a playmaker. They need help there. You could also argue at some point in time this team needs to find a young running back. They had to cut Joseph Randle. They brought in Christian Michael only to eventually cut him. Darren McFadden is Darren McFadden, so when he plays, he can be really good, but he sometimes has a propensity to put the ball on the ground, combined with the fact that he's Darren McFadden, so it's not a matter of if, but when he'll eventually get hurt, and then what the hell do you do? This is a Cowboys team that, if anything, this 2015 season exposed just how many flaws there are, frankly, on both sides of the ball. We can talk about Tony Romo's injuries and Dez Bryant's injuries and talk about how significant and how much of an impact they had. They did. The simple fact of the matter is, excuse me, this is not a good football team. They are a really mediocre football team. And 2014 should not be what we would have expected out of the Cowboys for years to come. We should have treated it more like the outlier that it probably was. This team needs some work, and they really need to hit big in this upcoming draft.